Hi, I'm David Judson, Editor-in-Chief of Stratfor. With me today is our founder and chairman, George Friedman. Thanks for joining me, George, and taking a few minutes.
Pleasure.
What I want to talk about today is a bit different. You're about to take a trip to Moscow. In advance of that, you wrote a piece about the trip and why you're going and what you're going to talk about there, which is really the internal model of how we approached intelligence at Stratfor. It got a lot of reader response. People are interested in this. So ordinarily we sit here and talk about what's happening outside our walls, but this was interesting and maybe an opportunity to talk about what we do inside the walls here. So what are the secrets that you're going to be sharing with the Russians?
Not many secrets. I'm invited to a university. We'll be meeting a lot of people. But it always has to be remembered that in English, there's a difference between intelligence and espionage.
Right. In
many other languages, there isn't. So what we do is intelligence. And Stratfor's method is fairly different, although, we discuss it publicly, because it really is impersonal. We don't spend a whole lot of time wondering what this president or that prime minister thinks, because we think that a country of 300 million or 100 million really doesn't depend on the will of any one person. It goes on and on. In fact, when you think about it, when you think about economics, nobody would say that the president decided to have a recession. That would be a kind of crazy thing to say because the president doesn't have that power. There's an impersonal movement. And that's what Stratfor is really founded on. The idea that in politics, as in economics, the decision makers usually do things that have unintended consequences, don't understand fully what they're doing, but are caught within impersonal forces that move them in a certain direction.
Well, I think this is one of the things that I sometimes struggle to explain as a recovering journalist, that from 50 yards away, what we do looks a lot like journalism. We publish articles. But in fact, it's very different, in part because we're talking about what we think is going to happen rather than what we think happened. But in your essay this week, you used a phrase that particularly caught my attention, which is, we look for what's hidden in plain sight.
The world is filled with information, some of it enormous, obvious. So there's a fact. 50% of Germany's economy is driven by exports. That's an enormous amount. It's going to have effects all through Europe. There's no one who doesn't know that, who's interested in this matter. But sitting down and saying, wow, what does that mean? That's what we do. So the problem is not to do what journalists do, go to a press conference by the Secretary of State and take notes on what he said. It's usually not even pay any attention to what he said, because what a politician says is about as interesting as what a annual report from a American corporation is. It's propaganda. But it's to take a look at the obvious realities of the world. The obvious realities of the world for Russia is that Ukraine is historically an indispensable part. There has been an event in Ukraine that is reoriented away from Russia. This will cause conflict. Now, drawing the conclusion is sometimes hard, not because the conclusion isn't necessarily obvious, but because taking such a daring leap and saying, as we said 2 years ago, there will be a conflict over the Ukraine,
right,
is difficult to do. And that's what we do. We look at the thing that is right there in plain sight and nobody else wants to see.
Right. And another kind of theme in this that I think is interesting to ponder is that necessity is predictable. How do can you characterize how we calibrate necessity?
Well, to begin with, if nothing is necessary, nothing is predictable.
Right.
The whole notion of the predictability of economics, to the extent that it's predictable, is that people are going to do what they have to do. They may not be aware of the consequences for the entire country.
Right.
They pursue their private interests, and in so doing, they build collectively the wealth of nations, as Adam Smith said. Adam Smith didn't invent the idea of the invisible hand. That really comes from Machiavelli.
Okay.
The idea that if you are going to hold power, the only way you can hold power is by doing certain things. And that if you really know how to hold power, you discover you have relatively few choices. You may think that I'm powerful, therefore I may do this, that, or the other thing, but in fact, if you're going to remain powerful, you're constrained. It's interesting watching Obama.
Right.
Obama had a very different vision for his presidency. History didn't care. He was going to be dealing with the Middle East. He was going to have bad relations with the Russians. His idea that because he had a marvelous personality, he was going to charm Frau Merkel, all these went away. Mm-hmm. The similarities between the presidency of Barack Obama and the presidency of George Bush is startling. And what's interesting to see is he genuinely didn't think it would be this way.
Right.
It shows you the limits of power. It shows you how power is shaped in such a way that it traps you into models. If you're going to be the American president, you're going to behave a certain way.
Yeah. So, one of the things you've discussed, and we discussed internally, is model-based intelligence, as opposed to the sort of source-based intelligence with which the public is more familiar because of Hollywood and drama. It's the model and modeling of reality that's at the heart of what we do. Is that a fair statement?
Yes, but let me first draw the point: the problem with source-based analysis.
Right.
The American intelligence agencies are excellent. I am certain that they were listening to or getting information about what the Soviet Politburo was thinking in 1991. The problem was that the sources, the higher they were, the less they understood what was happening to them. The problem with sources is that on broad historical levels, they have no better idea what's going on than you have. By creating a model which begins, but doesn't end, with basic geographical facts. Iceland is an island and it's cold, and starts very simply, and builds out from that the imperatives that a nation has to pursue, the constraints that a nation is under, and shows the intersection between those things in one nation and those in another, allows you to have some sense of what will emerge. It goes down many levels beneath that. This is not simply geography that we deal with, but it allows us to do some of the things that we've done, like forecast the incredible difficulties of the European Union, the decline of the Chinese economy, the U.S. rapprochement with Iran, tensions between the United States and Israel, things that are attributed to Netanyahu's personality or Barack Obama's ideology, actually become predictable when you look at it through this prism.
Again, just because I'm always tempted to compare what we do here with, my past life, we have narratives. The reemergence of Russia, the metamorphosis of the Chinese economy, the ongoing issues, what's happening with the European Union, that we as they evolve incrementally, we stop and take stock of how those are. But they're very different than when we think of media narratives. The media tends to, in my view, it's not so much the story they're working on, it's the story they're working from. So the Arab Spring becomes derivative of the color revolutions. An ethnic conflict is analogized to the American Civil Rights Movement, perhaps. Our model of narratives is very different than the conventional media notion of narratives. And maybe you could...
I think the one thing that we do differently that makes all the difference, we don't do interviews.
Right.
At the Arab Spring, if you went to do an interview, you'd have to find somebody who spoke English,
right,
which already skewed it,
right,
and you'd ask certain questions, which elicit certain answers. By depersonalizing it, by being uninterested in that level of analysis,
right,
we protect ourselves from being caught in the trap of feedback. I'm an American reporter. I'm going to ask you about your vision of the future. You're going to tell an American reporter what he wants to hear.
Right.
You'll broadcast that, and everybody will say, my God, liberalism has come to the Arab world. By ignoring that and focusing in very much on a question of precisely how many people were in Tahrir Square, and taking an overhead picture and saying, it looks like a big crowd, but it's much smaller if you actually measure the empty spaces. You wind up with a much less glamorous but a much more profound vision of what is going on the ground.
Do you think that what kind of reception are you expecting from your Russian colleagues, intellectuals, academics? I mean, part of what we do is sort of Hegelian. There's a bit of common DNA to what we do to the Marxist notion of dialectical materialism, with which they'll obviously be familiar. Do you expect a certain common analytical ground in the conversation?
Well, there's a kind of connection to Marxism, except that Marx was obsessed with class and we care about nation.
Right.
And the Russians care about nation now. But somewhere in their DNA is this idea of predictability that we share. And I suspect we will talk about our different methods of prediction. What I'm going to be interested in is when we sit down and have a glass of vodka, how far apart are our predictions? Are they seeing what we're seeing? Are they forecasting what we're forecasting? Our forecast for Russia is very bleak in the long run.
Right.
Do they see that, or do they see something very different? In other words, am I trapped inside an ideological sphere where I see Russia in bad shape? Are they trapped in an ideological sphere where they see the United States coming apart? Or is there, through this method that I think they share in some ways, is there a commonality? Right. That's what I'm going to be interested in finding out.
Enjoy the vodka, enjoy the conversation, and we'll be anxious to learn about your findings as soon as you get back to this side of the Atlantic. Thanks, George. Safe travels.
Thank you.
Thank you.